Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for our J Stream. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jess Smith. I'm J Street's COO. So welcome to all the new people who are joining us today, and welcome back to all of you who join us regularly. I can honestly say, despite the gray and rainy day here in DC today, that for the first time in many, many weeks, I am feeling very jazzed and hopeful about what's possible in 2020. It's been an exciting week. We just learned less than 2 days ago about Joe Biden's historic pick of Kamala Harris. This is a powerful ticket and, God willing, a winning ticket in November. And I'm looking forward to, in just a few days, the Democratic convention kicking off. It will certainly be a bizarre convention, the most bizarre convention of our lifetimes, but listen, it is exciting nonetheless, and we have 3 J Street events going on throughout the convention starting Sunday evening, so I hope you will join us for some, if not all, of the programming that we're going to be doing over the course of the next week. The reason that we're gathered here today is that this November, the stakes couldn't be higher for J Street, for foreign policy, for domestic policy, for our progressive values, and also the future of American democracy. And we're delighted today to have David Litt joining us here on our J Stream. So David, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
What's great about David, and we're so thrilled that he's here with us today, is that he's here to talk about some of the issues that I just walked through, what's at stake, what we can do to address some of the challenges before us. But he does it with levity and he does it through humor. David has a really impressive bio. He was President Obama's speechwriter and his special advisor from 2011 to 2016. But most important to me, he is and was Obama's joke writer. He was the lead writer for 4 of the president's White House Correspondents Dinners. He's responsible for Obama's 2011 address to the URJ, and he's written many speeches for many White House Hanukkah parties. He's the head writer and producer for the D.C. office of Funny or Die. He has written 2 books. The first, Thanks Obama, was a memoir that he wrote coming out of the White House. And then his latest book, Democracy in 1 Book or Less, How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think, was just published a couple of months ago in June. And David, I'm just going to hold this up. I don't exactly have a copy of your book. This is really Barack Obama's Audacity of Hope masquerading as your book, but it's the best that I can do in this COVID environment. So I'll show it to all of you.
Looks
good. Let me turn it over to David to get us started. Why don't you introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit about the book and why you're here?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Jess, and thank you to everyone at J Street for having me. Obviously a big fan of J Street's and all of the work that you do and the organizing that you're doing, thinking through this election and beyond. And also, I just want to thank everyone who is here watching from home. I know we're all like, the novelty of Zoom has worn off, so to have so many people joining to talk about this and hopefully to ask some great questions, it just makes me, well, I really appreciate it. And I appreciate also that you have even the printout of my book cover. I relocated for August, so I forgot to bring books with me. But now people got to see what it looks like. There's an American flag on it, so you know which country I'm writing about for the most part. That's always important. What I want to do is just talk a little bit about what the book is about, the kind of elevator pitch of the book. And then I know we'll do some questions. And I should also say, I'm sure everyone watching will be asked to send questions, but I have noticed, having done a long Zoom book tour now, on Zoom, for some reason, people seem reluctant to ask questions. So I'm going to continuously shame people into asking questions until we get some good ones. So with that in mind, please do ask questions about whatever's on your mind. For me, this book is about a really central problem, and it's one that I kept encountering when I worked for President Obama in the White House. And then obviously it's gotten so much worse under Donald Trump. And that problem is that in America, we have a democracy, and yet we, the people, keep wanting one set of policies, keep wanting one set of things from our government. And that's true on issues from COVID and how we respond to COVID these days. It was true on gun violence and gun violence prevention. the environment. It's true on foreign policy to a large degree. You name it, the American people want one thing. And generally speaking, it's not that the elites want something else. Experts agree that actually the people have it right. And yet our democratically elected government that's supposed to represent us is doing the opposite of what we want. And I had this moment as I was sitting in Disney World during Trump's inauguration, because that's where my wife and I went to try to make sure we wouldn't have to watch the speech on TV, and thinking, how would you explain this kind of a democracy to someone from Mars or someone from Belgium? And I realized I really couldn't do it. You know, I'd worked in the White House for almost 5 years. I had studied American history in college. I knew all the words to I'm Just a Bill from Schoolhouse Rock. And yet I didn't really know how our government works, or more importantly, why it's not working the way most of us feel it should. And it's not just Democrats, by the way, who feel the government isn't working. Currently, the number of Americans who trust Washington to do the right thing, and this was before the pandemic, was 1% higher than the number of Americans who believe in Bigfoot. So this is a widespread problem. And what I learned as I started to do this research, I started to go to different parts of the country, interview experts, talk to activists and political science professors and all these people. What I learned is that in every dimension, from voting rights to gerrymandering to the Senate to the role of the judiciary to campaign finance, our system of government is totally different than it was not just 100 years ago, but when I was a kid, which was just 33 years ago. You know, in my lifetime, and I don't think it's my fault, but in my lifetime, our democracy has become so much less representative in really a fairly short number of decades. And my goal with this book was, first of all, to explain what happened and where we are right now and how our system really works, which is not, sadly, the way we were taught that it works when we grew up. But my goal was also to explain what we do about it. And one of the things I hope we can focus on today is not just all of the depressing stuff, because there's plenty of it these days, but to also think about if we have an opportunity to make real change starting in January of next year, how do we make the most of it? And why is it that fixing our democracy, despite all of the problems, and I'm sure we're going to get into some of those problems, why is it that fixing our democracy is actually easier than many Americans realize? So with that, let me turn it back to you, Jess, and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Sounds great, David. Thanks. Thanks for this introduction. And, you know, you talk a lot in your book about how the American people want one thing, but then when their government leaders get into office, they provide something else that they were not bargaining for. And in your book, really the villain of your book is Mitch McConnell, I think is the villain of many of our books. And, you know, you talk about, I think there's, you know, this has been such a vicious 4 years under this Trump administration, exacerbated, I think, by a really caustic environment in the Senate where, you know, Mitch McConnell has been able to hijack legislation and be able to, you know, we've got a majority in the House. We will hopefully get a majority in the Senate if things go well in November. But for now, one political party certainly can hijack legislation and hijack best intentions of what constituents are looking for. Can you just talk to us a little bit more about how you've written about McConnell, this divisiveness in Congress and in Washington, and how we can fight back?
Yeah, I think Mitch McConnell really is, you know, I think I say this in the book, I spent more time thinking about Mitch McConnell than anybody who is not my wife or my cats over the last 3 years. And I have to say, of that group of people, I like Mitch McConnell the least by quite a lot. And to me, the thing that is fascinating about Mitch McConnell is that he actually, in many ways, despite temperamentally being totally different than Trump, he was Trump well before Trump was Trump. He talks, you know, he called his book, his memoir, The Long Game. And, you know, I've written for politicians, you're not supposed to talk about politics as a game in your memoir. You can think that way, although it's not recommended, but you're definitely not supposed to admit it. Mitch McConnell, more than any politician, I think, of the last 40 years, has viewed politics purely in terms of winning. And the insight that I think McConnell had, and I guess it's to his credit, some sort of credit, was that he realized that in the contest that is partisan politics, the difference between that and the old sport that Mitch McConnell grew up wanting to play, which was baseball, the difference between politics and baseball is that the players in politics make the rules. And so to a very large extent, while many of us who care about the future of this country were focused on the actions of the players on the field, Mitch McConnell was behind the scenes thinking about how you rewrite the rule book. And he, in many ways, really did succeed at that, at least in the short term. You know, I often think about the point of my book, the overall goal is it's kind of a guide for crushing Mitch McConnell's dreams within Mitch McConnell's lifetime. But that's going to be very hard to do, in part because he was so successful for so many decades while the rest of the country was not really paying attention to that effort. And I just want to point that out in the context of President Trump saying today that he's intentionally defunding the Postal Service in order to prevent mail-in voting. On one hand, that's unprecedented and it's terrifying. Those things are certainly true. But on the other hand, it's a very logical extension of where the Republican Party has been headed for years. And I think they probably would have gotten there without Mitch McConnell in charge, but I think it would have taken longer. And I think he understands, you know, he was kind of the first to latch on to that strategy.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing up the defunding of the Postal Service. And also, you know, what we're hearing about in the last 24 hours too, about our new postmaster who's failing to prioritize ballots being, you know, safeguarded through the mail, not encouraging them to be first-class mail products, and requiring states to step up, in fact, if they want more expedited mail, to pay for that. And this is certainly a marked change since the past. You know, one thing that you talk about in your book too is some of the conflict of interest that we're seeing in this government, particularly in this government, where we're seeing oil industry insiders stepping up to run our EPA, even the U.S. Postal Service. Here, you've got a conflict of interest with somebody who's got, you know, has a foot in UPS, a foot in FedEx, and is overseeing the U.S. Postal Service. You have Betsy DeVos, who has her own problems, does not like American public education. But you have leaders in charge who have no interest in actually providing leadership for what they do. And again, you know, we're doing everything we can do at J Street and in this community to ensure that the election goes our way in November. But talk a little bit about how this has affected the last 4 years, having these conflicts of interest built into the White House.
Well, I think it's actually a surprisingly complicated question. I'm going to end up at the same place that you did, which is saying this is really bad. But getting there is actually, the more you unpack it, the more difficult this stuff gets. Because, you know, one of the things I went through in the book was just to figure out how many times have presidents used the word special interest, and not just Democrats or Republicans. Both. You know, I wrote the word special interests for Obama many, many times. But generally speaking, when we talk about special interests, that just means interests we don't happen to like. And so, you know, in the kind of like Barney version of it, every interest is special in a democracy. So the question to me is less conflict of interest and more a question of which interests are being favored and which ones are being pushed out of power. And what you've seen in the last 20 years, and then it's gotten way out of control, and even more out of control in the last 4 years, but in the last 20 years alone, the amount of money private interests have spent lobbying Congress has more than doubled. And I don't think, for the record, that all lobbying is bad. I mean, J Street has lobbyists. Plenty of organizations that I love have lobbyists. But if you look at the amount of money that has gone into lobbying, the vast majority of that money, I mean, not just the VAT, but like the huge, you know, overwhelming amount of that money is from private businesses. And so what that means is that we've essentially privatized a huge amount of public policy making. And then what the Trump administration did, and the George W. Bush administration did this too to some extent, but the Trump administration was even worse, is they basically said, okay, well now we'll take all these private sector policymakers, these people who have expertise in government, in some cases don't, frankly, but you know, the number of lobbyists who are heading government agencies, and we'll just bring them into government, and then if we ever have to leave, we'll put them back into a policymaking role, but in the private sector. And one of the things that I think is very important is for Americans to realize just how much the private sector policymaking apparatus has expanded. That's something most people don't know. Most people actually think that the public sector policymaking apparatus has expanded. Most Americans, a majority, believe that congressional offices have grown, that there's more people who we pay to make laws on our behalf, but in fact, that's not true. The number of congressional staff has shrunk. So one of the most important things I actually think that we can do going forward is think about how to expand the number of congressional staff, particularly in places like the committees, where a lot of the institutional knowledge in Congress is held, and in places like the Congressional Research Service, which is like an in-house think tank, but Newt Gingrich cut it pretty dramatically in '95. How do you expand these services so that more people making policy are working for us rather than for somebody else? And I think you're not going to change. The next Republican president will likely bring in people from business because they believe that those are the people who should be running the country. The important thing is to think about how to make sure that we, the people, have a seat at the table as well. And increasingly, we're getting pushed out.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. Obviously, voting rights is a big topic for us. It's something that I know our leaders are very concerned about. And we find ourselves in dueling conflicts, problems right now. We've crises. We've got COVID hitting, and then we have, this big reckoning with racial justice in our country as well. In your book, you talk about the history of disenfranchising minority voters, and it's something that we see. We have a long history of it, and it's something that we see crop up election after election after election. We've seen it a couple of months ago in primary elections in Georgia and other places across the country. We've been spending a lot of time here at J Street in our J Streams. We've talked to Eric Holder a couple of weeks ago. We talked to Stacey Abrams both about her campaign that had record numbers of, removing minority voters from the voting rolls. 1.5 million people were stripped of the right to vote right before the election kicked in 2018. So we've had a number of speakers come and talk to us. It's something that's very important to us to maintain the sanctity of the election in November. Talk to us about things that you have learned in history and how we can ensure a good outcome in November.
Well, I think it's really important to rethink the way that we kind of internalize our own history as a country. Not in a way that says American democracy isn't real, because American democracy is very real. And in many ways, American democracy is extraordinarily inspiring. But the version of our history that I learned in school was basically that we just kept moving forward at a steady pace. Sometimes we moved forward very quickly. In 1920, women won the right to vote. That was a huge watershed moment. And then sometimes we moved forward slowly, where there's, let's say, years of marching, and then finally there's a breakthrough in the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act. The real history of America has to include the history of disenfranchisement, because there have been periods throughout our history where we haven't gone forward, we've gone backwards. I happen to be in New Jersey right now as we're talking about this, as we're talking right now. And one of the things I was shocked to learn was that in the beginning of American history, women could actually vote in New Jersey. This was the one state where women could vote. And in 1807, for a variety of sort of petty, very Jersey political reasons, the state legislature got together and they just took voting rights away from women, and at the same time also from African Americans and from immigrants. And those kinds of things have happened throughout our history, and they're happening throughout our present. The last 10 years in particular have been a period of really tremendous backsliding on voting rights. And I would even go back a little bit further than that and say, when I was born, or a little bit before I was born, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan won his first presidential election, about 2.5% or 3% of Americans had no voting rights, adult Americans. Today, that number is getting close to 10%. And there's all sorts of reasons for it. And then there's also, on top of that, the Americans who have voting rights in theory, but not in practice, because they're being blocked, or as the case in Stacey Abrams' election, voters are being purged from the rolls, or issues like that. And so, to me, there's two things we need to do. The first is the way to deal with voter suppression in the short term is to vote. One thing that I think the African American community has done very effectively is turn the attacks on voting rights into a call to action, a way of proving that your vote matters. If your vote didn't matter, people would not be working so hard to take it away. And I think there's other categories of voters, Hispanic voters, there's young voters, where votes are being actively targeted. And it's important to make sure people understand that that's not a sign that your vote won't matter. It's a sign that your vote matters a lot. And it's worth going through the extra trouble in the short term to register and to vote. The second thing, and that I think is important, is ultimately, once you win an election, because we're not living in a world like Belarus or something like that, where there's no way the opposition can win an election. It's just harder for Democrats than it is for Republicans. When Democrats win, they have to prioritize leveling the playing field for the next time. And that doesn't mean making it impossible for Republicans to win. I don't think we should live in a one-party democracy for either party. But it does mean things, and President Obama spoke about this in his eulogy for John Lewis, it means things like automatic voter registration. It means things like higher standards for polling places. There should be a maximum number of voters per polling place, so that states are hiring enough poll workers. There should be a minimum amount of poll worker training, because that would help bring down these long lines. All sorts of things that we should be doing that, again, this has been a big day for voting rights. Larry Kudlow from the Trump administration described voting rights as part of a liberal wish list. I think most Americans would be surprised to learn that voting rights are a liberal issue, but I do think it's a reminder that the way to restore voting rights starts with winning elections, and then after that, keeping our eye on the ball and making sure that we don't say, oh, we won, so the danger's past, but to say, we should not have had to run this race uphill. Let's make sure the next time the playing field is level.
Yep. Super, David. Let me pause here for a second and just say, for those of you who have questions, please put them, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We ask you to submit your questions. David said at the top of the call that he's going to shame anybody who does not submit questions. So please keep them coming. I have a couple more that I will get to, and then we want to turn it over to audience questions. I want to stay with this, this topic of voting and what happens in the November election. This electoral process is so complicated. You have voter suppression. We have all of these concerns with the U.S. Postal Service, especially in this COVID environment, and the vote by mail, making sure that every vote is counted. You said, voting matters, every vote matters. Many of us know this well, and it just cannot be overstated. I know I worked for 2 years on Al Gore's presidential campaign. In 99 and 2000, we thought we won that election. And then after weeks of ballot counting, we didn't prevail because of the Electoral College process, which I think is another element on top of all of this that really muddies the waters. It helps polling information not be the most accurate, because we really don't have a good gauge on how this will turn out at the end of the day, because popular vote doesn't amount to a win. We saw that in 2000. We saw that with the Trump-Hillary race as well. I think there was a difference of 3 million votes in this past election. And that's significant. So the will of the people here and the vote is trumped literally by the Electoral College process. I know you write a lot about this in your book. I want to talk us through that. And I don't know if you have any predictions of how the electoral process gets in our way in November's election.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I will say I'm kind of, I took a quick glance through the Q&A, and so some people have sent questions, so no shame for you. But everyone else, public shame or private shame, because you're all watching this from the privacy of your own homes. But please do ask things, and some of the questions have nothing to do with my book, which is totally fine. Just ask me stuff. And one of them was to repeat the name of the book, which I realized I'm supposed to do as an author and totally forgot. So the book is called Democracy in One Book or Less: How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think. And the Electoral College, which is in the book, is the shortest chapter in the book, because I tried very hard to be kind of fair-minded, even if I have strong opinions about all of these issues, to sort of go through and say, here's why it's complex and nuanced. The Electoral College is really stupid. There were some reasons we had it when the country started out, but it's worth noting that for those of you who are Hamilton fans, the election of 1800, the one that got its own number in Hamilton, was a result of the Electoral College being a terrible system. It was our original Electoral College. Between 1800 and 1804, this didn't get covered in Hamilton, sadly, but if there's a sequel, they revamped the Electoral College. The 12th Amendment changed it. So changing the Electoral College is not unprecedented. In fact, it's one of the first things we did as a country, was to say, hey, this is dumb, let's make it work better. And now the new version has turned out to be a real mess. one of the things that I think is important to recognize about the Electoral College, even though we changed it last time using the 12th Amendment, the amendment process is not the only way to get around the Electoral College. So there's something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. In the political reform terms sometimes need a little zhuzhing up, but that's what it's called at the moment. And the way that works is if states join it, they say instead of giving, let's use Washington, D.C. as an example, instead of giving Washington, D.C.'s 3 electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote within the District of Columbia, which is how they currently do it, we'll give our 3 electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. But the compact only kicks in when you have 270 electoral votes worth of states in the compact, which would make a majority. And what that would do is it means that basically you go around the Electoral College so that you still have an electoral vote, but the electoral vote winner and the popular vote winner, by definition, are always the same person. And one of the things that is helpful, two things about that are helpful. So one, the Supreme Court ruled on that earlier this year, and it was a very strong ruling in favor of allowing states to basically say, we're going to tell our electors to vote however we decide. So states have the legal authority to do that. And also we're getting closer and closer to that 270 vote threshold. So I believe it's 80 something votes, might even be 70 something. I think it's in the 80s. Electoral votes away from getting rid of the Electoral College, which is not that many. And I don't think it's going to happen in 2020, but I do think it's quite possible that the Electoral College could favor Democrats relatively soon. And once that happens, I think Republicans will very quickly discover that they don't like the Electoral College either. And I think that will be a moment we can get rid of it. I think in this election, it's really interesting. I mean, you're seeing some reports. There's been an interesting split, I guess. And I don't know why this is. Live interview polling is suggesting that the Electoral College sort of boost for Trump would be about half the size of his margin in 2016. It could even be 0. And then a lot of the online polling is suggesting it might be even bigger, 3% or 4%, that Trump could lose the election by, an even larger margin and still win based on the Electoral College. I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. But I think the thing that I was most worried about going into this, which is that the President Trump could lose by, say, 5% or 6% and still win the presidency, seems less likely today than it did a year ago, which is good, not just, by the way, for Democrats, but also for democracy as a whole, because I think that would be a real constitutional and existential crisis for the country when you had a president who clearly lost, not just by in a close race, but in an overwhelming amount. And then the one other thing I do want to say, just to go back to Al Gore, is that not only was that election decided by the Electoral College, it was also decided by a lot of the voter suppression issues that we're talking about today. I mean, there's a voter purge that took 12,000 eligible African-American voters off the rolls in Florida. If that voter purge had not occurred, Al Gore would almost certainly be president right now. And one of the things, I was talking to a political scientist at Johns Hopkins recently, who was saying part of the problem that we've had as a country is we should have started sounding the alarm in 2000. And we're doing it now, which is good. But one of the reasons we let things get this far is that there was a sense of propriety where we said, well, let's not talk about that in 2000. And it's only gotten worse because we haven't created any consequences, electoral or otherwise, for people who try to win elections by changing the rules rather than by persuading voters.
Great. David, thank you. You give me a little bit more hope for what's possible through the Electoral College system for this election. I am going to raise up Larry Gelman's question where he talks about, he asks, this is a watershed moment. There's so many hate sites and even mainstream campaign TV ads where the truth and the facts are becoming increasingly irrelevant. How do you respond to this? How do we ensure that the facts and the truth are getting out and not being muddied by the hate sites and the untruths?
Well, I think it's really challenging. I wish there was an easy answer, and there definitely is not. What I will say is, I think that in the short term and on a personal level, what can each of us do? I'm a big believer in not deleting your Facebook account, and I don't like Facebook at all. I think that they're, as close to evil as a corporation can get these days, which is very sad. And that said, I think that one of the ways to combat online disinformation is to put real information out online, or to push back against misinformation, not in a necessarily a rude way or a way that makes the internet even more toxic than it currently is, which would be saying something, but in a factual way and in a way that says, it's important to not let things go unchecked. I think one of the dangers to our democracy is people being ridiculous on one side and then everyone else just being exhausted on the other. And it is exhausting, but it's sort of our responsibility as citizens or as non-citizens to check misinformation when we can. The other thing I will say is I think that I don't know what the future will hold, and it could be very bad. There's plenty of bad possibilities, but I do think that it's important not to despair about those kinds of issues, because I think the other danger that you see on the Republican side is that they are getting trapped in their own bubble. And right now, Fox News drives the Republican Party, and then all of the kind of Fox News affiliates, and then you're getting even fringier than Fox News. That is not compelling to 60% at least of the American people. It's probably compelling to, let's say, 30% of the American people. If we end up in a country where you need a majority of Americans to govern, Fox News would become a liability to the Republican Party rather than an asset. The only reason Fox News is an asset to the Republican Party is because it's married to these sets of rules that make it possible, although difficult, to govern the country with 45% or 43% of the country's support. So if we were living in a majoritarian country, like we sort of were told we were when we were kids, that would also it would disincentivize some of the disinformation peddling that you see out there.
Super, thanks for that. I think this is actually a good segue into another question that's asked by Robin Lieberman, and I'm going to read it out loud. Let me see if I can put it into the chat as well. It says, Joe Biden is running to restore civility and order, which is great, but his administration is going to be governing in a very different environment than the Obama administration did. What do you think Biden needs to realize and prioritize to move the country forward and not just revert to the Obama days?
Well, I will say, and obviously I worked with the speechwriting shops in the Obama White House were pretty divided, where I didn't write speeches for the vice president, but I know all of his former speechwriters and a lot of his former staff. And one of the things that gave me confidence about the prospect of a Biden presidency, even early on, is that the people closest to Joe Biden and the people who have worked with him or for him they absolutely believe that he's the right guy to do all the things you just described. And anyone who has worked with or around politicians knows sometimes the politician staff are the least likely to believe in that person. So the fact that with Joe Biden, his sort of biggest cheerleaders and biggest believers are on his staff is saying something. I think that the answer here is twofold. So some of these issues about how we don't just sort of move back to an era where the president isn't an existential threat to the country, which would certainly be nice, involve policy, right? So, climate change, unfortunately, we've had 4 years of moving backwards on climate change. So we can't just kind of go back to where we were rejoining the Paris Accords. We need to, take a series of much more aggressive actions on climate change. I'm not an expert in that stuff, but I'm happy to see that on these policy areas, if you look at the Biden agenda, it's by far the most progressive in history. So I think there's a lot of good things there. But I also think it's really important, as you referenced, that the political environment is different. And I think when Obama took office, there was an open question of whether Republicans were going to say, he has a huge mandate, he's this new transformative figure, we need to change our policies, our attitude in order to meet this new era. Clearly that didn't happen. I think that this time around, you can't wait very long to assume that obstruction is happening again. President Obama, for example, in his eulogy for John Lewis said, if you can't renew the Voting Rights Act, then we should get rid of the legislative filibuster. I would say, if that's going to be our standard, then let's put forward the Voting Rights Act immediately, and let's not give anybody, let's say there's already 2 strikes against you. Because one of the things that we see, not just in a potential Biden administration, but in general in presidential politics, is you have that window that opens at the beginning of administration, and it never gets easier after that. So I hope that not just on the filibuster, but on a lot of other issues, a Biden administration uses that window not just to talk about those policy issues, but to shore up our democracy with some of the things that we've been describing and some other things that I talk about in the book that we just won't have time to get to today. But to me, making the most of that window will be the deciding factor in whether we can put the country back on the right track in a long-term direction, or whether we're stuck in this world where we're kind of always one bad election away from another Trump, or potentially a smarter Trump who knows a little bit more about how the country works on day one, which would be really scary.
Great, thanks, David. Your book is largely about domestic policy and how things are broken domestically within our system of American democracy. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't turn for a second to foreign policy. It's what we're built on, the fabric of our organization, and our mandate is really solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and restoring diplomacy, American diplomacy abroad. So talk to us, we at J Street had enjoyed a very good working relationship and a close working relationship with the Obama administration. We have lost our ally in the White House, it goes without saying, for the last 4 years. And we've had some major setbacks in terms of peace, in terms of having any kind of sane foreign policy directed either at the Middle East or across the globe. Give us a preview, if you can, give us a glimmer of hope of what a new Biden administration looks like on this issue and on foreign policy for large.
So I am not. I'm not a foreign policy person. I should make that very clear. And it was when I was at the White House, my kind of one of my sort of specialties was like Jewish related speeches that were domestic policy focused. So, kind of deploying Hebrew school in the service of the president. But when it got to the foreign policy stuff, that's where, people who J Street folks will be familiar with, Ben Rhodes, Terry Zuplat, other speechwriters on the foreign policy side would take those paragraphs, even in those domestic speeches. What I want to say more broadly is that I think one of the things that we're seeing, and this is true around the world, and it's certainly true in Israel, and it's true in the United States, and it relates both to foreign policy and to some of the things we've been talking about, is that this idea that you can have an illiberal democracy, which is what Viktor Orban, the strongman in Hungary, kind of terms it, that you can have a democracy where you can maintain a system that is fundamentally unequal and that fundamentally does not treat everybody the same way, but you can still have a democracy. That just doesn't work. We're seeing it in the United States with systemic racism. I think we're seeing it in Israel with the way that Palestinians have been treated for many, many years. And ultimately, the cost of maintaining that kind of system will be that everybody loses their democracy, loses a real system of free and fair elections, and loses the rule of law. And those are things that should matter to all of us. So I think that, again, like I said, I'm not a foreign policy person, but I do think one of the things that I hope and expect that we would see from a Biden administration is much more forceful pro-democracy work around the world. And that means both the literal, pressuring Belarus to end its crackdown on protesters, pressuring the Chinese government to allow democracy to continue in Hong Kong, but it also means pressuring governments to respect human rights, to not try to, to not try to marginalize their own people and treat their own people in these vastly unequal ways, both at home and then abroad. So I think, I don't have too much of a preview, but I hope that that's what we'll see more broadly. And I also think it starts at home by setting an example for other countries. I mean, the United States used to be an example of how a democracy should work. And increasingly, we're looking to other countries for examples of how to corrupt our own democracy. And that's something that's very frightening.
Thanks for that, David. I'm going to just put out another plug for those of you who have questions to put them into the chat. David, while we're waiting for some additional questions, maybe we can just lighten things up a little bit. If you can tell us maybe your best moment or your funniest moment in the White House working for Obama. I saw something, by the way, where for many years he called you by the wrong last name, missed you, didn't properly know your name. But let me throw it to you. Give us a funny story.
Sure. It's certainly a weird transition, but yeah, and it's always strange to be introduced and say, oh, this guy wrote jokes for Obama. Now he's going to talk about why our democracy is in crisis. Great. This is going to be so much fun. But I will say, one of the things that I certainly miss, both from my old job, but also just as an American, is having a president who can laugh. I wrote something about this a while ago for the Times, where like you don't realize it till you start paying attention, but Donald Trump never laughs. And it's a very strange personality trait. It's the kind of thing where like if a plumber came over to fix a leak and they just never laugh, you'd be like, I'm not sure I should hire this person to be a plumber. And yet we've hired this person to be the president. And one of the things that I didn't realize until looking back on it was that a lot of the stories that I kind of, that I included in my first book, or that I would, that I kind of tell, involve President Obama laughing. Like, I got to be part of the Luther the Anger Translator video that we did. So for those of you who may not remember or may not have seen it, the sketch on Comedy Central, the idea was that Jordan Peele played Obama, very cool, calm, and collected, and then Keegan-Michael Key, his partner, played Luther the Anger Translator, and would kind of scream about all the nonsense America was putting him through. And so, as you might expect, President Obama really liked this character and really wanted him to, come to the White House Correspondents Dinner. So we wrote up this thing. And so I got to be kind of the staffer watching the rehearsal. And for me, first of all, just this bizarre moment of being in the map room. So you're surrounded by all these World War II military maps with troop formations, and reminded of the gravity of what's happened here. And then you're watching this comedy sketch with the president. And President Obama could not stop laughing the entire time. Like anytime Keegan opened his mouth, the president just lost it. And actually, even if you go back and watch the performance where he did hold it together, to his credit, he would very carefully, he would look with his head, he'd tilt his head toward Luther, the Anger Translator, but then he would like look away with his peripheral vision. He went into it with a strategy to make sure that he didn't laugh. But, so stuff like that, I don't know, there's many, many reasons my experience at the White House was special, and some of them are, monumental and very West Wingy. And then there's just moments that were like, well, how on earth did that get to become part of my life? That was pretty cool.
Excellent. David, we're coming to the top of the hour shortly. I wanted to just pause here and see if you had anything else that you wanted to share with us that you wish you had been asked, or if you want to leave us on a high note of November will be great, and we're going to come out on the other side with flying colors.
So I will say I have no idea if November will be great or not, and I think that's important. So let me try to end on a kind of what in 2020 might qualify as a high note, and also something that we didn't talk about, but that I think we should, and they're related. So I think that one of the things for me about a democracy, which is sort of fundamentally unsatisfying, but also fundamentally inspiring, is that we don't know. The question to me is never, do we know what's going to happen, which is too bad, because I wish that we knew that it would be all right. But instead the question is it still up to us? Or is it no longer in our hands? And as I was writing Democracy in One Book or Less, it coincided with the protests in Hong Kong. It coincided with protests in Lebanon, in Iran. And it's a reminder that people around the world, and I keep bringing up Belarus because it's recent, where there was a stolen election there, are literally willing to die for a democracy as flawed as the one that we live in right now. And it seems unlikely that we'll be asked to do that. It does seem likely that we're going to be asked to do a lot between now and November to preserve the democracy that we've got and to make it better. So I think while it remains in our hands, it's going to take a lot of work. And we're seeing that the Trump administration, and President Trump in particular, are not limited by the limits that other presidents have felt on their power, that he's going to do whatever he can to try to win, including cheat. I mean, this is a guy that cheats at everything. I think it's only to be assumed that he will try to cheat in an election. And so I think that just means essentially you know, if all of us are sort of beginning and ending the day by saying, did I do something? Then I feel very good about our chances. I think, and I think I went into 2016 saying Trump's a wacko and somebody else will take care of it. And I regret that. So I think that's important. The one other thing I will say, just because I talked about Trump a lot, is that one of the things that I think that Democrats and progressives need to do differently is focus more on down ballot races. And that's one thing we have not discussed. So I will also point out, in addition to getting involved in the national presidential election, there's also tons of local races that are on the ballot this year that matter a lot. President Obama endorsed a list of 118 candidates recently. About a dozen of them, I believe, were state legislative candidates. That's a good start if you're looking for local races to get involved in. And if you're one person, if you're watching this and thinking, how can I have an impact? The impact you can have on a local race is enormous because so much attention is being paid to those, you know, top ticket, the White House, the Senate, and so on. And so I think, and much of the election law, much of the way our elections are administered is done by local officials, not national officials. So I think the overall answer to your question about how November will turn out is, if we do our jobs, November will turn out well. And I think we just need to take the most expansive, most intense view of what our jobs are between now and then. And if we do that, then I feel very good about where we'll end up.
David, thanks for all of that. And I just want to remind everybody who's joining us today that one, you should join us at our convention activities over the course of the next week. And our final one will be about mobilization efforts for the fall. I know many of you are already partaking in all of our phone banks that we have that are going on daily across the country. And we've seen tremendous turnout. So thanks for all of you who are involved in that. Keep it up. I don't think we should take November for granted. We should all feel like we did our part get there and have that successful outcome. I know that Nate put in the chat earlier a link to your book and how to buy it. I'm going to hold this up right now. I encourage you to get David's book. Many of you probably have Obama's Audacity of Hope already. So time for you to use David's book. And David, thanks for offering us some insight, walking us through a history lesson and challenging us to step up and take matters into our own hands as well. So thanks for the time today, and thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.